And you pointed out, too, that it's not just a matter of preserving individual rights, and we see sometimes in conversations with lawmakers here in California that there's, I think, a desire to put people back in private spheres that, well, you're fine to have your religious liberty as long as you do it in your own home, or maybe you're contained to your churches. But you were saying in your book that really it's more important to have a robust protection that extends to voluntary groups that are, in some cases, even subsidized by tax donations or nonprofit designations, but that perhaps we don't have the richness of protection right now that we should be. And I know that's a challenging argument, given that some of the groups that we see demonstrating, for example, UVA and places, are often sponsoring ideologies and beliefs that many people find hurtful and deeply offensive. So what's the role of these voluntary groups, and are there any limitations that you think we ought to consider when we're sponsoring them?
One of the challenges that makes voluntary groups so important is the practical reality of how commingled, both for governmental and sometimes theological reasons, we actually are in society today. So this space right here is regulated by a whole host of local, state, and federal laws, right? And so we think of this as maybe a private space and a private institution, but really, there's a fire code, and there's probably codes about what you can eat in here, and we could go on and on, right? There'd be hundreds of regulations, and so the regulatory state today is in our lives everywhere. It's impossible to avoid, and so are government dollars. And then on the other hand, for many of us, our faith intuitively and intrinsically is one that we want to share and be outward about. And this is something that's missing from the other side of understanding sometimes. There was a law that was proposed in Illinois within the last year that was offering protections to churches, but only if they open their doors only to their members, right? And you thought, well, that's actually not what a lot of churches want to do. They want to open their doors precisely to others to come into the church. Yeah. And so the theological impulse to share and expand your faith beyond just the closed doors of your own community and the governmental realities of where government dollars and government regulations are means that this is a really complicated space to be in.
Sure. And the public space is, as you pointed out, very complex, and you're going to have a cacophony of voices. And to lighten things up a little bit, I was reminded that in your book you talk about being a fan of the show Parks and Recreation. So I know many of you are also fans out here. And even though it's set in small town Indiana, I want to point out that it's filmed, at least the exterior shots, just down the street in Pasadena. So, they can say it's Indiana, but we know the truth. But in that show, the comedic value shows up when they're having these town hall meetings and these public discussions about things that are obviously resonating with the voters, and whether it's banning small, this activity or big gulp drinks. There's people are very passionate about that. What role do you think those conversations have in promoting confident pluralism? Because sometimes we just end up fighting in those discussions, even if it's about silly things. So tell me a little bit about your thinking on that.
Yeah, in the public forum generally.
Yeah.
One of the biggest wins for me was when one of the actors read part of the book and wrote a little reflection on it. Now, kind of a bit player in the show, but it was really nice of him to do, and I'm a huge fan of the show. And I think, actually, this isn't quite to your question, but just to pause and note the importance of humor and stories to what we do and how we engage with others, and to be able to, even in the midst of challenging conversations and when people critique us for who we are, they think we are, instead of just responding with an immediate retort, just sometimes to laugh or point out an irony or something like that. So, and I think Parks and Rec does that well. There are vignettes about local government practices, right? The smallest park in the state of Indiana, or the horse Little Sebastian, for some of you. Our kids love that song. They sing it all the time, almost ritualistically in our house. And I think these stories highlight the reality over silly issues that we don't actually get too energized about, but to point out that this is actually how local government works at its best, is to figure out how to come together and find common ground. And one of the places we do that is in what's technically called the public forum, the idea that the government locally and federally and otherwise provides spaces that are government funded and government managed spaces But within those spaces, the whole idea is that citizens and their groups come together on their own terms to express themselves and to argue their own points in the manner in which they would like to do so. And it's a critical part of how our constitutional design is intended, that we allow these breathing spaces for people sometimes to come together and sometimes to remain apart. And so there are scenes in Parks and Rec where people are just kind of shouting at each other, but even the ability for people to do that in government spaces within the bounds of peaceability and stability and order, which are important and tricky, but we have to have those spaces, and increasingly we're losing them. And so I think part of what Parks and Rec is showing is reminding your average television viewer that there's an important civic component, that we're in it mutually with the people we elect to govern us. They have to provide the spaces, we have to use those spaces well, but we have to remember why they're there, and that part of having them there means a bit of risk and instability, that we're not always going to agree with each other, even with the ways in which we express ourselves.
Yeah.